Good afternoon, everybody, and today we're going to have our lesson on the Renaissance. Perhaps you've heard the expression of a Renaissance man, or the word utopia, or someone who's quixotic. These are all words that stem from a certain time period in Europe from approximately 1300 to around 1600, where there was a flourishing of interest in classical learning. The works of ancient Greece and Rome are revived. There's a flowering of the arts, literature, painting, sculpture, and there's a great focus on human potential. The Renaissance itself has its seeds in Italy, and then eventually it will spread throughout Europe, coming to England much later than its initiated appearance in Italy. It was a period of great change, a period of great growth, where people were stirred by imagination, a thirst for knowledge, and the idea that human potential would be unlimited. The word you've probably already become acquainted with has in its background the sense of rebirth. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of interest in the Greek and Roman culture, rebirth in the superiority of the potential of human beings, rebirth in an interest in the arts. Whereas in the period that we just covered, the medieval period, most thought centered upon God and the quest for religion, or questions of religion. In this time period, people as individuals become the most important subject of study. I realize this is not a history class, but we will talk about a couple of different ideas in terms of a historical perspective before we get to the literature of the time. This is a time period where the monarchy becomes a centralized, recognized power. Henry VIII, over in England, who separates from the Catholic Church, creates his own Church of England, his own Anglican Church, based upon his prerogative to be done with Catherine of Aragon and move on and marry Anne Boleyn. Other monarchs in England, particularly Elizabeth I, becomes associated with an entire time period. Her reign is often referred to as the Golden Age of Britain or the Elizabethan Age. These powerful European monarchs created the sense of what it means to be a nation of people. Not to be ignored is also the growth of science and technology. People like Nicholas Copernicus, who observed that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but rather the Earth was orbiting around the sun. This was seconded by Galileo. His observation of the planets proved it, but again, this concept that the scientific method becomes supreme. Humanism, by its very root word, puts humanity at the center of its study. Humanism was inspired by studying the Greek and Roman culture. It was a celebration of human beauty, human potential. Just look at the artwork from the time period. From Leonardo da Vinci to Michelangelo, there is an emphasis on the beauty of the individual. Mentioned before, whereas medieval thinkers centered on God and the afterlife and questions that pertain to religion itself, during the Renaissance, the scope becomes, or the focus becomes more on people as individuals. They are the most important subject of study. And limitations are broadened. The age of discovery, with names like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan, initiate this pioneering spirit, this idea that explorers are drawn to unknown shores. It opens up a whole new experience in terms of trade and interaction with other human beings on another side of the globe. Most scholars agree that one of the most interesting aspects of the Renaissance is the change in class distinctions. If you go back again to the Middle Ages, feudalism is now giving way to new roles and different rights and responsibilities placed upon the class structure. An aristocrat is no longer one based upon birth. Merchants who make a lot of money, who earn their own fortunes, could be awarded titles and power. Look at the Medici family of Florence. They were technically bankers and merchants. So instead of being born into a certain caste and dying in the same caste, the Renaissance allows the opportunity for some upward mobility and this emergence of the middle class, this thriving middle class of craftsmen and shopkeepers and merchants. Let's turn now to the literary aspects of the period. I'm going to be talking about 4 pictured authors on these slides, and there's one that I actually left out, so I'm just going to pencil him in when the time comes. But let's begin with Francesco Petrarch. We are in Italy in 1304 to 1374. Petrarch is the first person to use the term Renaissance. He's also referred to as the father of the sonnet. He is the first one to create this model of the 14-line poem. He wrote in the language of the people, in the vernacular of Italian, and his 366 sonnets and odes can be found in what was called the Book of Songs, or the Canzonieri. Just like Dante and his love for Beatrice, Petrarch is often associated with his love for Laura. And Laura seems to be his muse, his inspiration. She may be the woman that the speaker is referring to in Sonnet 3 when we begin our study of Sonnet 3. The author that I left out by mistake is a French writer, and he is Pierre de Ronsard. I'll give you his birth and death dates here as well. 1524 to 1585. Not so neat. Sorry about that. 1524 to 1585. Pierre de Ronsard. Now, Ronsard, along with 6 other writers, became part of an influential group known as the Pleiade. This was a name that was derived from the 7 stars of the constellation. He was often called the Prince of Poets, and his sonnet that we're going to be looking at, To Hélène, has reverberations later. If you remember a poem by Yeats, we'll talk about that in class when the time comes, but it's a great carpe diem kind of sonnet. Boccaccio, back to Italy, 1313 to 1375, is the first author that we're going to be studying. And Boccaccio was not initially encouraged to be a writer. Actually, throughout his whole life, he wasn't encouraged to be a writer. His father wanted him to be a businessman or a lawyer, someone who worked in the government position. But he eventually achieved greatness as a poet and a storyteller and a scholar. He actually became friends with Petrarch. He wrote a biography of Dante, and his most famous collection is the Decameron. This is a collection of stories, and we'll talk about the similarities between it and the Canterbury Tales, that consists of a little competition among 10 people where they're going to be telling, each person is going to tell one tale for the 10 days that they are together. And we'll talk about the reason why they happen to be together when it's time to begin the piece. Over now to Spain. My Spanish 4 students would be able to tell us probably a good deal of information about Miguel de Cervantes. This was a man who was the son of a barber, a surgeon. He enlisted as a soldier, and at one particular battle, the Battle of Lepanto, he was severely wounded, and he was often referred to as El Manco de Lepanto, the man who was wounded in his arm. On his voyage back from battle versus the Turks, he was captured and kidnapped and taken by pirates to Algiers, and eventually ransomed and returned to Spain. But because he couldn't pay off his debts, his ransom debts, he eventually came up with this idea of a novel centered upon a crazy character, Don Quixote, and this piece of literature eventually became considered the first modern novel. We'll talk about the reasons why at a later date. And finally, but not the least of importance, the most important, 1564 to 1616, in the small city of Stratford-upon-Avon, we have the great bard of all time, William Shakespeare. Very few details do we have regarding his life, but we can pencil in a couple of minor facts. We know that he was born in that date. It's often attributed to April 23rd, mainly because of the date of his baptismal in Trinity Church in Stratford. At the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway. She happened to be 8 years his senior, and strangely enough, their first baby, Susanna, was born less than 9 months after the wedding. So connect the dots and wonder if perhaps in some way this may have been a little bit of a shotgun wedding. We'll never know. Shortly thereafter, we do have another record of two other children being born, a pair of twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet unfortunately dies very young. He's only 11 years old. But aside from that, most details are kind of sketchy. There is an anti-Stratfordian movement that believes that Shakespeare was not the author of the 35 plays and 2 narrative poems and 154 sonnets that he wrote, but leave that for other people to debate. For us, we will concentrate on good old Will as being the author of the sonnets that we're going to be studying, and of course the great play, the tragic comedy, The Tempest, that we'll be covering in a week or two. So in terms of the Renaissance, we come back full circle, and we'll just say that this is a time period where an emphasis on writing and all arts is recognized and appreciated, and it's a period of great growth and inspiration where the individual is celebrated. With that in mind, we shall begin our discussion of the Decameron and Giovanni Boccaccio. Thank you.